CJRed presents Accidental Proposal by CJRed. Chapter 25. A Soul. They were running late in the morning, so decided to stay for breakfast. Narcissa was missing, which was all for the better. Lucius had been surprised to see them and immediately started talking shop. He had informed the pair that an official announcement of their engagement would simply have to be out by the spring, and no later. He cleared his throat a few times as he said this, his face rather pale, but his voice held firm. Hermione decided to give the poor man with dark circles under his eyes a bit of a break, and nodded. "It's not an engagement I object to, Lord Malfoy. It's the rushed wedding. To put it bluntly, it's crass." She watched as Lucius Malfoy sat back stunned, and then nodded, his eyes going wide. "Well, yes. Typically you'd be engaged for 6 months. We would hold balls and such, introducing you to society." Draco snorted but cleared his throat. "I said after graduation. Is it possible that if neither of us graduates, the spell would be in suspension?" Hermione looked at him again, her brow furrowed. "You were getting at that. I said the first Saturday after graduation. Are you suggesting we can simply continue our schooling and the spell will continue on?" Lucius was looking between them, his eyes narrowed. "Tricky spell, but it is all in the wording. Now, tell me again. What exactly did you say?" Draco repeated what he remembered, word for word, and Hermione nodded in agreement. Lucius stood up, staring at the wall for a moment, before he said, "Have you sealed a bond?" Hermione went bright pink, while Draco frowned and said, "Father, really?" Lucius sighed. "The house elves put no protections on either of your rooms. That tells me that the spell has already been sealed. You are, as far as the spell is concerned, bonded. The marriage may take place whenever you wish. The records will be recorded at the manor, which is, of course, locked down by the ministry. As long as no one finds those records or the proof you carry of this bonding, you can relay that you found a way around the spell and hold a wedding whenever you wish." Draco was frowning, because his father was looking directly at Hermione as he spoke, as if he were telling her something. Hermione flushed and broke eye contact, turning to Draco. "What is my father meaning to tell only you?" he asked curiously. She went a darker shade of pink, and he knew she was deeply embarrassed and uncomfortable. He looked back to his father, who looked furious, his eyes widening. "A true match? Impossible!" He yelled so loudly the blood vessels on his face stood out against his pale skin. Draco stood immediately and pointed his wand at his father. "Do not use such a tone on my betrothed," he warned. Lucius spun around, spittle on his lips. "Betrothed, is it?" He turned to glare at Hermione, who was standing now, her wand out but at her side. Her eyes narrowed and her face went pale with anger and embarrassment. "Haven't told him, have you? You have the gall to open your legs, but not to—" There was a bang, and Hermione looked up to see a shaking Draco. He was staring at his now bound and silenced father. A house elf walked in then, and pushed Lucius into a chair, shaking its head sadly and mumbling about insulting the young Lady Malfoy so. Draco turned to Hermione. "I only silenced him." Hermione sighed. "I bound him. He looked like he might forget himself." Draco narrowed his eyes at her, and then shook his head, running a hand through his hair. What was that elf mumbling about? Hermione thought about shrugging in response, but she met the glaring gaze of Lucius Malfoy, and instead straightened up and sighed. "I was going to share this with you in Paris. Pansy figured it out right before we left. It's the reason no house elf has bothered us. Let's hand him over to the mind healer, who can give him a calming draught." She turned to Lucius and raised her wand. "And perhaps sort out a case of boils." Lucius stiffened before he nodded and relaxed. Draco smirked and unsilenced his father. "I swear, she is more Slytherin than I am some days." Lucius glared but bowed his head before he said, "My apologies, Miss Knott. I forgot myself. You only just realized about the bond?" Hermione shrugged, not acknowledging his apology. "It's an obscure pure-blood spell you only share with your own children. How would I know? Obviously, Draco missed that lesson." Lucius chuckled, which shocked them both, before he said, "He did not. He simply wasn't interested, after hearing what I mentioned beforehand." Hermione was back to flushing, and then said, "Boils, sir." Lucius chuckled again. Yes, Draco, she would have done well in Slytherin. No mercy. We will announce an engagement immediately. No use not to. After she explains, I think you will understand. Now, do untie me. I assure you I mean you and your lady no harm. Draco was so stunned all he could do was give them both a confused look. He had just watched a parley, and he wasn't sure of what. He shook his head slightly and untied his father, and watched in utter confusion as his aristocratic father bowed to Hermione, taking her hand and calling her my lady, before he bowed to Draco. He then wished them both well in Paris, and showed himself out of the room, assumedly to return to his mother, as if they had just enjoyed a lovely breakfast. What in the name of Salazar was that? Draco said, staring at Hermione, who was brushing off her stunning day robes. Can we please talk about this later, and not here? Draco sighed, nodding in acquiescence. They sat down to finish breakfast, while a tisking house elf hurried them and reminded them that they had a portkey to catch. When they landed in a beautiful enchanted garden in Paris, Hermione gasped as Draco chuckled. It's our townhouse in the city, he whispered in her ear. Hermione shook her head in wonder, and followed after him as he took her hand and escorted her up the beautifully sculpted stone steps. They reached an ornate door that was opened by the oldest house elf she'd ever seen, who spoke in French, welcoming them to the small house, as he called it. Hermione laughed silently at that, as the townhouse looked to be at least 4 stories and have enough bedrooms to hold 5 families. How small is this place exactly? She whispered to Draco as they were led through several hallways and upstairs to a master bedroom, which also shocked her. Draco grinned, thanking the elf who bowed and left with a loud pop. 10 large rooms, similar to this. The music room, library, ballroom, sitting room, dining room, drawing room, smoking room, and conservatory. For tea. He shrugged and smirked at her. Hermione shook her head, taking off her traveling coat. How did you talk the elf into letting us share the same room? Draco frowned and looked around before he said slowly, I didn't. Hermione went pink and sat down on the bed, her breath coming out in small little puffs. Oh. Draco sat down in a lounge chair. So, what was all that with my father, and what are you not telling me? He waved his hands around, gesturing to the room. It clearly has something to do with why we are in the same room and can supposedly marry when we wish. Hermione went pale, and then red, and put her hands to her cheeks, as Draco frowned. Hermione, I promise I won't be angry. I doubt you did anything. I am assuming this was the spell or something you were not aware of. She nodded, still quiet, trying to find the right words. Draco sighed. Do I need to flew Pansy to explain? Hermione jumped up, looking horrified. No! Draco held out his hands, palm up, beseeching her. Then talk to me, Hermione. Hermione could feel her heart beating frantically, and she knew she would have to tell him or show him, probably both. Well, definitely both, but this was so much sooner than she had anticipated. Oh, why didn't she have more time? Damn Lucius and his meddling. Damn those house elves giving them away. She was shaking as she slowly stood up and slowly unbuttoned her day robes, not looking away from Draco, who was now sitting very still. He was watching her silently with a mixture of desire and confusion, and maybe a little fear playing on his face. She pulled her robes down to her waist and took a deep breath to gather her courage and remind herself that she was a Gryffindor. She unhooked her bra and took it off. She heard his gasp and held her breast and gestured so that he could see the mark. You got a tattoo? He asked in confusion. She snorted and looked at him. No, the spell has been sealed. You have one too somewhere. Draco sprang up, frowning, shock showing on his face. He walked over to her, grabbing her breast gently and staring at the mark. The house elves, he said, sounding like it was suddenly all making sense. That's why. We're already married. Hermione gave a small, tight nod. Technically, to them, yes. Draco looked up, meeting her wide, frightened eyes. I had no idea. She gave him a small smile. Obviously, I didn't. Draco gave a dry chuckle and then slowly and carefully covered her back up, sitting her back on the bed. I haven't noticed a mark on myself. Hermione swallowed but nodded. It's usually somewhere that only your partner would see. Pansy told me, Hermione whispered. Draco looked at her and nodded. He immediately stood up and started stripping. Hermione flushed and looked over at him until she gasped and pointed at his left hip bone. "It's there, Draco. It matches mine. It's hard to see on your pale skin." Draco had to go look in the mirror to see it, and it was indeed hard to find. He shook his head and then got dressed again, sitting with her on the bed and taking her hand. "Well, at least we will not have to marry on the first Saturday after graduation," he said, his tone somber. Hermione couldn't help it as she burst out laughing. "But we're basically already married, against our will," she said, unable to hide her bitterness. Draco sighed and hugged her to him. "Did you intend to marry me?" he asked carefully. Hermione thought on that and then said slowly, "Yes, I did. I will, but when I want to." Draco laughed. "So consider the mark a magical engagement. What does it really change, Hermione? I want to marry you. I am desperate to finish my mastery so that I can marry you. We own our own destiny, and I suppose all this proves is that you were always supposed to be mine." Hermione looked into his silver eyes, so bright and sincere, and felt tears start to fall from her own. She shakily wiped them away and managed, I don't deserve you, Draco Malfoy." He smirked for a moment before he grabbed her hands and kissed her. "No, I definitely do not deserve you. So are we good?" Hermione nodded shakily. "Yes, I'm glad you know. I hated keeping a secret from you." Draco smirked. "And that is why you are not really a snake." She pinched him, and they laughed before laughter turned into kisses, and kisses turned into clothing being removed. "Do you want me?" Draco asked heavily as he kissed around the mark on her breast. Hermione was panting. "Can't you tell?" Draco gave a rather evil smirk. "Not desire me. Do you want me? Me with all my faults. Do you want me, Hermione?" His hand traveled around and linked with hers as he moved over her so that he was centered over her, but not entering her. Their gazes met and held. Hermione bit her lip as he teased her. "Draco, of course I want you." "Forever." Hermione lifted her head up and kissed him with all the passion, need, desire, and love inside of her. She felt her breast burn and gasped as Draco slammed into her, moaning. Suddenly, everything turned all white and blue, and it was truly magical. "What is going on?" Hermione asked as she moaned, the emotions swamping through her. "I feel you," Draco said with a moan. "I feel what you are feeling, and I think you are feeling me. It's a true mate spell." He was panting as he spoke, and his back was arched. Hermione was barely able to keep her own arms around him. She was so overwhelmed with emotion, as pure love washed over her. "Draco!" "Yes, feel what I feel. Understand what you have done to me." Hermione locked her arms around him and hid her head in his neck, allowing him to take over as the spell washed over them. She poured her own love into him, and when they finally both came, they collapsed into each other. Draco was panting, and Hermione was silently weeping tears of shock and joy. "Will that always happen?" she finally whispered, exhausted. Draco groaned. "No, only when needed, if I remember correctly, to strengthen the bond." "Bond?" He moaned softly, moving her so that they were still connected, and throwing a leg around her. His arms were holding her to him, his breath brushing her neck and giving her chills. "Soul bond, Hermione. We are soul bonded, you and I. We will always find each other. It's what had Father spitting mad. You are forever mine, and I am forever yours. No magic can undo such a bond." Hermione gave him a sleepy nod, knowing that she was going to have to wait to ask him about this when she could actually think. She snuggled into him and whispered, "Draco." "I love you." His hand trailed down her arm and back up. "I love you too." Hermione smiled sleepily. It would all work out. Somehow it would all work out. They had adversities to face, certainly, but she knew that everything was going to be okay somehow. Maybe this was because of the magic still buzzing around her and her muddled brain, but for once, Hermione Jean Granger was not going to second-guess herself. She closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep, to the sound of Draco's heartbeat and his quiet breathing.